Great night for uncovering the clues to why we're all here. What in the world are we doing here? Why do we go to school, learn a trade, earn a living, get married, have kids, become part of a community? Why? Why do we struggle? Why do we attempt to succeed and bear burdens of illness and loss and fight for what all too often in retrospect appears to be foolish goals? And then, of course, we all die. Why do we bother to do the things we do? Death isn't an option round these parts, it's a certainty. What, then, is the point of it all? Well, we're going to try and get to the bottom of that this hour, believe it or not. I don't know what other radio shows are trying to tackle this evening, but we're tackling the big question with Dr. Mark Klein. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you for having me, Tommy.
You're going to have to give me some time tonight, Mark, because I booked this thing before I read your book. And now I've read your book, and you took on the big question in a, what do we have here, in a roughly 200-page book. And you, at least in your mind, got to an answer in 200 pages. Rather extraordinary. Right?
Right. I could have made it longer, but why prolong the
inevitable?
The suspense, at least. And first, let me thank you for taking the time to read the book. That was very kind of you.
Well, anybody who doesn't read the book and then talks to you is a fraud. What's the point? First of all, it's not a long book. Second of all, it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. I can start out saying I highly recommend The Currency of Life, Uncovering the Clues to Why We're Here. Mark E. Klein, M.D., author. Mark, let me start out by saying you're an M.D., you want to write a book. I realize this is your second. I didn't read your first. It's got a provocative title. What Do I Do Now? A Handbook for Life. This is your second book, The Currency of Life, Uncovering the Clues to Why We're Here. You're an M.D. What are you doing writing this stuff?
Well, as a doctor, your primary mission is to help people. It sounds trite, I know, but I still believe in this. And there are lots of ways to help people. In fact, you help people every night, I'm sure. And
I don't know about that.
Well, I'm sure you try. And the commitment I think all of us have to make is to try and make the world a better place, to make life better for people. So the first thing you have to figure out is it possible? Are we just stuck? Are we doomed? Is it hopeless? It certainly seems that way reading the news, I would think, for many people. But as a physician, you get to talk to a lot of people, and I like to say, I think I mentioned in my first book, that when you speak to 100,000 people and you listen to the words on their lips, the story of the world unfolds, if you're willing to listen. And it unfolded to me, I believe. I'm not trying to make myself out to be something special, but I think any of us have the potential, when we start to look at the world, to realize this is a very peculiar place. I hope you started to appreciate that from reading my book.
Well, I thought it was a peculiar place long before reading your book. The idea of this strange place being difficult to figure out, a tough nut to crack, a strange and seemingly absurd environment, that's been discussed and bandied about for years. The idea of getting to real answers has been a more difficult process. The idea that you have been able to is fascinating to me. I don't disagree, by the way, with the answers you come up with. In fact, what I'd like to do is get at how you came up with them. Somewhere along the line, apparently, in talking to all your patients, then you felt yourself coming face-to-face with the big questions of life and perhaps coming face-to-face in some sense with some answers. That's the reason you wrote this? That's what started you down this road? Because I imagine as an MD there are all sorts of books you could write that have nothing to do with theology or spirituality.
Well, I didn't start out, sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write a book about the purpose of life, and let's see what I can come up with. It really wasn't like that. In fact, I think that's a very difficult thing to do. Actually, what happened over the years, things would come to me, observations, let's say, and I would make notes, as many people do. Some mental, I happen to put them down on a computer or a piece of paper. And what became clear to me over time was that there is really an incredible story unfolding here. Let me preface this by saying that I'm a science guy, so I'm your basic skeptic. You have to prove things to me. I just don't believe things because somebody says them or it's conventional wisdom. One of the things I have found over the years is that conventional wisdom, the usual explanations for things that we all accept from our childhood on, are often incorrect, more often than we choose to believe. But as you start to investigate and allow yourself to see maybe a different answer than the standard answer, an incredible story unfolds. And for me, it was one to which I had never been exposed, and I would venture to say that most people have never been exposed. And the question is, why are we here? Once you begin to look at this and you start to understand what's going on, you realize how powerful this question really is. You know, we go through our lives, we all have our jobs and our families and our illnesses and our turmoils and our angst and, of course, our good times. Most of us don't stop and ask that question, well, what am I doing here? Not formally, at least. It probably goes through our mind at times of stress or illness and so on. But when you actually stop and think about the world, as I mentioned and you agreed, it is a very unusual place. And when you actually address the question of why we're here and come up with some answers out of science and out of objective evaluations, not just some spiritual moment that came to me, you begin to understand that this is incredibly powerful and it can really change lives and, in fact, change the world. I'll give you one example that really struck me, is that through my investigation, really, I came to understand something that maybe was obvious to many of your listeners and perhaps to you, but not to me, really, and that is that there really is no such thing as an insignificant life. No one really needs to feel that your life is meaningless or insignificant or hopeless. And I'll tell you something else I learned. Each one of us, believe it or not, is in effect omnipotent. And I think I try and discuss that in my book, if you recall, but it's really true. Each of us, in fact, has the ability to create reality. We together create this world. Reality isn't something you're dumped into. Rather, it's something that we create. And it's a fascinating discussion of how we actually go about doing that.
Well, you mix in some quantum physics in this. You mix in some discussion of the notion of space and time. You look at some of the reasons people have said we're all here. Some of the goals that you typically hear for people while they live this life, and you dismiss many of them and give it evidence for why you're dismissing them. But let's find a starting point here. One of the places you start is the cyclical nature of our faults and foibles, and the sad story of history, and how we seem to endlessly repeat the same mistakes over and over again throughout the eons.
Correct. We always hear as children, as adults, to ignore history is to repeat it. So therefore, we must study history, we must learn from history. And believe me, I'm all for education at every level. It's a great thing. But to believe that the study of history will prevent the next catastrophe or fiasco, either personally or as a community or as cultures, is incorrect. And isn't it peculiar that we don't seem to learn? You and I and all your listeners make the same mistakes, I'll bet, as their parents, as their grandparents, as every generation that preceded them. We don't seem to collectively learn anything. It's as if the movie starts or the play starts all over again with each one of us. We take that for granted, but when you stop and think about it, it's kind of peculiar that we haven't learned, that we can't say, oh, yes, I've seen this mistake performed 5,000 times over the eons, and therefore we don't need to do this again. But yet we never do. That's kind of peculiar. Let me just, perhaps as a starting point in addition, I might say that the first half of this book is entitled, The World is Not What You Think. And the reason I called it that, and again, I use some very simple physics, and I hope you were able to follow it and didn't find it too convoluted. I don't want to scare your listeners away. But physics, especially 20th century physics from Einstein and something called quantum physics, which sound like horribly complicated topics, and they probably are if you learn them at a physics major level, but the basic concepts are not difficult to understand, and when you learn about these things, you realize, oh my God, the things we take for granted, simple things like time, are not anything like we assume them to be. And once you start looking at these things individually, both in science and outside of science, in the events of our daily lives, you realize that what seems that we just take for granted, things that seem so simple and commonplace, are in fact quite strange, like the need to repeat every single error again and again and again.
Well, for instance, we do know, and I don't feel the need to challenge these physicists and to go back to college and try to learn a way to argue around them. I just accept what they've passed along to me, our great physicists, which is that there is actually in science fundamentally no time or space, really. That's a construct that is a bit of an illusion.
Well, there's no, if I may, to just add on that, I think it's maybe more helpful to say that there's no flow of time. In other words, we imagine time. I would say most people listening to this program, and certainly I felt this way for many years, is that if you imagine time, you picture a timeline like you might see in a history book. And on the left, you find the birth of civilization in Mesopotamia and the Roman Empire and the birth of Jesus and the Industrial Revolution, and then that's all kind of grayed out, like the options on a computer screen that you can never seem to get to when you want, kind of grayed and unavailable. And then you have this light shining on today, on right now, on this moment. This is lit up. It's bright. And then to the right of this, everything would be blank. It's the future. It hasn't happened. It's just a white piece of paper, blank piece of paper. And that is how most of us would envision time. Well, it turns out that's not at all correct. Time is much more correctly viewed as a giant block of ice where every moment of time is frozen. So rather than a flow of time from past to present to future, imagine a giant block of ice with every moment of time that has occurred in the past, that is occurring now, and in fact is what we would call the future, all exist simultaneously. Now, some of your listeners might think this guy shouldn't be on the radio at this hour. He's been drinking too much. But the truth is that is exactly how time is, proven many times over, proposed first by Einstein, and this is well-known physics. And if you grab your local physicist tomorrow and you say, this guy on the radio claimed this, is he right? The physicist would say, oh, yes, that's quite correct. Time doesn't flow. Time is like a block of ice.